Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Vision's CEU series. My name is Beck G. Cohen, and I'm the Director of LGBTQ+ programming at Vision's Adolescent Treatment Center. Just wanted to talk a little bit about us. We're an adolescent treatment center program here in Los Angeles, California. Our programs include mental health residential, dual diagnosis residential, extended care, PHP, IOP, and Vision's Day School for adolescents ages 13 to 17 or 18. We also have a specialty clinic in our West LA location with therapists specializing in OCD, eating disorders, trauma, gender, sexuality, and more. You can always feel free to reach out to me about any of our programming. And some general housekeeping. You must be present for the full hour for your CEU, and we'll have question and answer following the presentation, and you'll receive a link for a survey after this to fill out, and then your certificate will be emailed to you from Georgina. And that's about it for the housekeeping. So now I get to introduce our speaker for today, Ashley Rollerson. I'm going to go ahead and read just a little snippet of your bio, which is always kind of weird as a presenter, I know. But Ashley's been working with adolescents and their families for over 7 years. Her training she has training in diverse modalities. They lend for an eclectic lens within her practice, which includes spiritual exploration, existential questioning, trauma process, somatic coping strategies, and attachment repair work. Ashley practices DBT and trauma-related therapies in private practice, home case management, as well as at Westside DBT. And I always like to bring something personal and I have had the pleasure of training alongside Ashley and road tripping through Utah. And I just admire her passion for the clients that she works with, and the insistence on having hard conversations around race, gender, class, even music, sometimes gender, sexuality. And I'm just so grateful to learn from you today and to call you a friend. So I'm going to pass it over to you, and everyone enjoy.
That was so kind. Thank you. I've had the pleasure of not only working with Beck, but also with Vision's Adolescent Treatment Center, which I have a huge soft spot for. Once you're part of the Vision's family, you are a part of it for life. And so I'm really grateful that I still get to participate in things like this under their umbrella, because they really appreciate hard conversations. And I think that that's great. That's how we learn. That's how we move forward. So let's get started. There's a lot, but I'm going to try and make this as, simple as possible. So, first and foremost, we're going to talk about the intersectionality between marginalized groups. And a part of this webinar, part of the proceeds go to a nonprofit of choice. And the nonprofit that I chose is California Black Women's Health Project. When I was looking into different nonprofits, because I don't work a lot with a ton of nonprofits, I was amazed to find such great resources. The California Black Women's Health Project specifically is geared towards Black women, and it's not just through mental health, it's through physical health, it's through job resources. I mean, they really kind of have the full picture. Just their statement, we are unapologetic about advocating on the premise of intrinsic value in the history and heritage of Black women, employing culturally competent interventions that are relevant, appropriate, and effective. I just loved that statement. They're unapologetic about their advocacy, which I would like to think is my style as well. So I'm really proud and happy that they are, going to get that donation. Also, another thing that I thought was really cool about their program, a part of their mental health processes, they go into beauty shops and they train the beauty techs to talk to the women about mental health and to provide mental health services when necessary. And I thought that was brilliant because statistically, Black women get their hair done in salons. So to go in and train those, women who are doing their hair, women and men who are doing their hair, is pretty amazing to me. And so, yeah, I'm really a fan of this organization. And apart from this nonprofit, there are tons of other nonprofits geared towards marginalized communities, specifically in California. These are just a handful. I mean, there are thousands of nonprofits in California, but the importance of nonprofit, especially with mental health resources, is that we are very heavily a private pay industry. We don't have a lot of state resources or even federal resources, to be honest. And so nonprofits serve as a buffer in some aspect, where they do have resources that are usually at an affordable cost. The difficulty is because the need is so high, there are wait lists and they can be months out. So to support these organizations is key so that everybody can get resources that they need. One specific organization, the Okra Project, is specific for Black trans women, which I thought was mind-blowing. There are not a lot of resources specific to Black trans women, who are one of the most marginalized communities in our country. Well, probably in the world. Okay. Let's get started with things to consider. I need to move back your little square. There we go. Okay. So nobody knows what they don't know. This was really important for me to put in there because my personal experience with doing this particular presentation and project was I was forced to look into things and learn about things that I had not previously learned about because the population that I serve does not fit within that population. So, I realized that there was a lot of work that I needed to do as a woman of color, as a clinician who identifies as pan, that I needed to actually look at what am I not seeing? How am I not, am I actually seeing this this system in a way that actually supports all individuals? I've primarily worked in private pay industry. And so it was eye-opening to see how challenging it is for people to get services if there is some sort of socioeconomic disparity, even just finding diverse races as therapists, and also finding a fee that is feasible. So, we don't know what we don't know until we learn it. So hopefully today you guys can learn a bit about marginalized communities and how maybe we can shift in a direction where we're looking at the bigger picture. And I have some ideas for that. Next is creating safety. It goes beyond education and implementation, but rather a choice to get uncomfortable and sit in the unknown with an open heart. We can go to as many trainings and conferences and, we can do our due diligence, read all the books, which yes, we need to do. But we also need to implement it in the therapy room. We also need to implement it within our places of work. We need to start changing and adapting. It doesn't just mean we learn. We also have to really have an open heart to, stepping into somebody else's shoes and potentially not fully understanding what they've gone through, but be able to sit with them with whatever emotions come up around it. It can be uncomfortable, especially when we talk about privilege, which we will definitely talk about a lot in this presentation. But, we need to look at how we as healers and clinicians need to really just be humans with another human and figure out what comes up for us. So we'll leave it at that. The next is we all have privilege and still can experience a lack thereof. Really important to remember, just because we have privilege doesn't mean we have, had moments where that privilege did not exist. And this is, I mean, and we're going to get into intersectionality, but, you know, just because you are white and cis does not mean that you are always in a place of privilege. That is not what that means. But we do have to recognize when we are in certain spaces, when we are in privilege, and what our privilege is, because we do have privilege in many spaces. I have privilege in certain spaces. And so we have to look at how that works within the framework of clinical care. And then finally, every person has their own unique experience that can be erased by generalizations around privilege. So when I started working with folks, low cost, no cost, you know, the assumptions that I made was that these people were in poverty. And these are my own assumptions, that these people were in poverty, that, you know, they, you know, couldn't afford rent, et cetera, et cetera. Not the case. Many people can't afford therapy because it's an expensive, it's expensive. And even if you are middle class, make a good amount of money, adding, I would say on average, even if it's $100 per session, adding $400 per month extra for mental health care is not really in somebody's budget. There's tons of other ways that we can generalize privilege, right? We can generalize that if we see a person of color, that they have in some way gone through, you know, some sort of racism. That may be true. Most of the time it is. Not always, though. We have to understand that every individual is unique. And there's so many different factors involved. So we also need to, like we do with, you know, every other client that we work with, we need to sit in the room with them and see specifically what they need, and specifically what privilege has done for them specifically, not necessarily in general. Okay. So in order to start this conversation, we need to talk about racism, specifically institutional racism. I pulled this right off of Wikipedia because it's pretty basic. It's a basic concept and reality. I would tweak a couple of words in this Wikipedia definition, but we'll go with this. So a form of racism, I would like to start with saying, no, it's not a form of, it is racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues. Again, let's change that to it does lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. So there is institutional racism within the clinical mental health realm. There is. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge the privilege in the room. We have to acknowledge that racism exists in most systems because we as a country were founded off of racist practices. We were founded off of violence against Black folks. You know, so as a society in the US, I mean, that's a big part of our history and a big part of how society has been formed. So we need to understand that institutional racism is everywhere and we can't ignore it anymore. I think we've tried, you know, some of us at least who have had the privilege to be able to ignore it or be able to, you know, say, well, that's not who I am, so therefore, you know, it's not a big issue, or, oh, we live in Los Angeles or wherever in California. And, you know, that's just, we're not that way. We're liberal, our value system is different. It doesn't necessarily matter how you show up. It does matter, but it's more about the system as a whole. How does the system as a whole show up? And that goes into insurance, that goes into healthcare, that goes into access and resources, that goes into marketing. Who are we marketing to? I mean, it's a wide spectrum of areas that we have some blind spots in. And so I'm hoping that we can kind of figure out how to navigate that. We need to define what marginalized communities are. So marginalized populations are groups and communities that experience discrimination and exclusion, social, political, economical, because of the unequal power relationships across economic, political, and cultural dimensions. You've probably seen BIPOC a little bit more. It stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's the newest, probably most politically correct term to talk about people of color and the spectrum of people of color. Queer, trans, cis women, low socioeconomic status, addiction, homeless community, etc. There are so many more ways in which you can fall within a marginalized population, even having to do with where you live. Are you in the middle of nowhere? Are you in a place where there are resources for you? Maybe in a bigger city or with, just access. So we're going to be specifically, at least in this presentation, the marginalized community that I'm going to speak about most is the Black community and kind of intersecting with, I would say, sexuality. But we're going to primarily focus on Black folks and that specific community, and we'll mix in some socioeconomic in there as well. So intersectionality was a term created by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's an amazing woman. So if you ever have a chance, I would actually go on YouTube, go online, look up Kimberly's TED Talk, look up anything that she has done, and it's pretty mind-blowing. She's incredibly intelligent. She's just, the fact that she can kind of put together this idea that we are so interwoven with different aspects of who we are that we cannot pinpoint one thing. And so I really think that that's profound that we acknowledge that, because not every Black person's experience is one experience. A Black trans woman's experience is going to be different than a Black cis male experience, is going to be different than a Black cis female experience. And then once you dive into that intersectionality, right, you then have to dive into that person's individual experience with trauma, racism, with their own, whatever it is, homophobia, transphobia. Okay, then you have to dive into socioeconomics. Then you have to dive in, I mean, the layers of oppression, right, can be infinite. And so we have to look at all aspects. So intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they can create obstacles that are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain types of problems. Yeah, again, anything that she has on the internet, any book, read it. I mean, she's pretty phenomenal. That's intersectionality, okay? So we need to talk about socioeconomic privilege. That has to do with how much money you have. In this country, if you have more money, you have more power. You have more access to resources. I mean, it goes on and on and on. This picture really stood out for me as I grew up in LA. I actually went to Beverly Hills High. I would drive down this street quite a bit. And this is the sight that you would see. You will see somebody homeless asking for change next to a luxury car, next to people and tourists wanting to see, expensive stores and money and wealth. And we have a huge disparity in this country. And that lends to a lot of problems when it comes to the mental health community, when it comes to the physical health community, just all around. So we need to recognize that we need to see who we're working with in terms of socioeconomic privilege and who we're not working with, and why. Why aren't we working with certain socioeconomic classes or marginalized groups? There's tons of different answers for that, but I just want to leave it at that for now. And then also, how can we open it up for a diverse range of socioeconomic groups? Our fees are high, and even going through insurance is privileged. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Not everybody has insurance. Not everybody can access it. So, yeah. Okay. This is just a little video about exactly what it looks like in the US with socioeconomic disparity. So.
Income inequality has always existed in the US, but the gap between rich and poor hasn't always been as wide as it is today. Let's take a look at how economic and political forces have changed the share of income held by the whole bottom 50% and just the top 1% of earners. The mid-century was a period of economic stability. The richest 1% earned 13% of all U.S. income, while the bottom half earned 20% of income. In the 1960s, Americans were still riding a post-war job boom. In the 70s, the lowest-paid Americans got a boost from a steadily increasing minimum wage. Sky-high salaries weren't as typical as they are today. The 80s changed everything. Minimum wage stagnated. Factory jobs were automated or outsourced. Ronald Reagan passed huge tax cuts for the richest, and executive pay soared. By the mid-90s, the earnings of the top 1% surpassed everyone in the bottom half altogether. The rich were on a tear, and even financial crashes in the 2000s didn't slow them down. Today, the share of income claimed by those at the very top and those in the bottom half are completely reversed from what they were in the 60s. Other countries don't have such a wide gap between rich and poor. Among economically developed nations, the U.S. is one of the most unequal, according to the Gini Index, which rates places based on how wealth is distributed. The higher the number, the more unequal the country is. The top 1% in the U.S. is primarily made up of men. Women-dominated fields like teaching and waitressing are lower paying. Women are promoted less often than men. They make 82 cents for every dollar that men make. The top tier is also very white. Minority groups face systemic racism that has contributed to gaps in education, housing, and employment opportunities. African Americans make only 78 cents for every dollar white people make. Inequality varies across the U.S. because of regional economics. Large urban areas like New York City are more unequal because they have low-income residents as well as those in tech, finance, and other industries that offer sky-high wages. Whereas the Great Lakes region is more equal because the wage gap there isn't as wide. Race plays a role too. Southern states, which are generally more racially diverse, tend to be more unequal, while pockets of the West that are more white tend to be more equal. Upward social mobility is especially challenging for those at the very bottom. The rich tend to stay rich, and the poor tend to stay poor. So what could be done? Some legislators have proposed putting the brakes on runaway wealth by raising income taxes on top earners. Many states recently increased the minimum wage, and some states are closing education gaps by expanding access to early learning programs. But on a federal level, there's no consensus, and ultimately, closing the gap between rich and poor will require agreement from an increasingly partisan government, as well as societal shifts to combat sexism and racism. Change isn't around the corner, but understanding how we got here in the first place is a good first step.
Watching that video every time is challenging. There's powerlessness in that. In that fact that there are a large group of people who do not have the means to, focus on their mental health, to even focus on their physical health. You know, when your basic human needs are not met, you don't have the luxury of excess. You don't have the luxury of, you know, extras. And so we really need to look at that as healers and clinicians, and how we can change this system. There we go. Okay. As we all know, we are in a pandemic, and that brings a whole nother slew of issues when it comes to treatment of marginalized communities. So, you know, clearly, as we all know, there is a huge mental health crisis right now. I, as a clinician, am totally full. I'm full. I'm beyond full because I cannot take anybody else on. I also, you know, people are calling and asking about insurance. People are calling and asking for lower cost services. I have opened 6 spots in my own private practice for low to no cost services, specifically for marginalized folks. That filled up in an hour, 1 hour. And I'm going to present some cases that I've been working on, and you know, we're going to look at the intersectionality of what's going on and why they can't afford therapy. You know, and this pandemic is not over, so this is just going to keep compiling. So we really need to work on getting additional funding for mental health resources, and I'm going to talk more about that later. So as some of you may know, COVID and systemic racism totally go hand in hand. There is a huge discrepancy with BIPOC folks compared to white folks, and we can go into why that is, right? It's, again, all of these things compound on each other. So if you don't have money for basic human needs, then you can't afford healthcare. Healthcare is astronomical. I mean, it's hard enough for me to pay for health insurance. And you know, I have a career, and I'm lucky enough to work for a company that provides that option. Not everybody has that option. So not only is there no healthcare, right? But then there's, you know, okay, how can you take care of yourself when you are in a lower socioeconomic bracket? Usually nutrition is not as good. Usually the areas in which they live in tend to be populated and therefore have more pollution. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on, right? So yeah, when a crisis happens, you see exactly how systemic racism works. And we're seeing it today more than ever. So the CDC reported, again, considerably elevated adverse mental health conditions associated with COVID. Pretty self-explanatory. I mean, increase in substance use, elevated suicidal ideation. Parents right now, anybody who has a child, don't even need to explain it, you know, like having to homeschool your kid while also potentially having a career. I mean, just go down the line, right? This is a huge issue, and we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough community mental health care services. We, you know, nonprofits have month-long waits. And then there's private practice. And we can choose to slide or not. We can choose to open up spots that are specifically for low cost. I'll get more into that, but yeah. So one thing I really do want to talk about also is marketing and mental health. Who are we marketing to? We need to look at the fact that in private pay industries across the board, there is a goal of making money. It is within a capitalist framework. What makes it difficult as healers and clinicians is that we also have an obligation to do no harm. We also have awareness around disparity, around socioeconomic disparity. We have awareness around the fact that people need help and can't afford it, but places need to stay in business. So there's the dialectic, right? One of my pet peeves, and Beck knows this, anytime I see a marketing brochure, if there are all white people or cis white families, then I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe to refer people there. I don't feel safe as a clinician even to work with people there all the time, because what it says to me is that how I look is not what they're marketing to. They're not marketing to Black folks. They're not marketing to Black, Indigenous people of color. They're marketing to white cis families, because we know that mostly the people who have the wealth and have the money to and the resources to go to treatment are white. And we need to really look at that, and we need to look at the message that that sends, because even in private pay industry, there are still going to be people of color. There are. It may not be as many, honestly, because of how things are set up, but you still have it. So what are you communicating right off the bat about your program and about, you know, your awareness of marginalized groups? So acknowledging systemic privilege and socioeconomic privilege, diversity within the marketing community, race, gender, sexuality, body positivity, etc. If you have ever gone to a marketing event, I want you to take note of what you see in regards to diversity. I want you to take note in what you see in regards to gender, race, sexuality, even body positivity, because when I would go to some marketing events, it would be very cookie cutter. Everybody would look pretty much the same. And again, what is the message, right? Is the message that, you know, our community is one type of person, or that our community is actually diverse, and that's what we, or if it's not, that's what the goal is to get more folks involved, to get different people involved, so that everybody can be seen, felt, and heard, and so that we can all learn from each other. To be honest, we all need to learn from each other. Scholarship beds within treatment centers. One thing I admire about Visions, they're very good with scholarship beds. And, you know, I will say that it is mind-boggling to me when certain places may put financial gain over humanity. You know, and I get it. The dialectic is we all need to make a living. The dialectic is we all need to take care of ourselves, our families, and there is a really hard line to figure out, you know, how do you do that while also being aware of the fact that we chose to be healers, we chose to take this role on, so we need to follow through with it. And that may mean, you know, doing work for free. That may mean doing work at a lower cost, you know, sliding scale fees in private practice, acknowledge need to diversify the private practice industry in mental health care. You know, a big thing that I've learned through all of this is there are not many Black therapists, especially in West LA. I know probably 4. And, you know, there is a need. There's a huge need. And that's something on my end where I'm looking at how to, you know, get more involved within my community and figure out ways in which, you know, to alter that fact. But we need to recognize why it may not be as diverse, and how that connects to socioeconomic privilege, and also fees, because fees are high, as they should be. Being a therapist is hard, where it's exhausting work, emotionally and physically. So those fees, I think, are valid. And how can we balance it out a bit? So what can we do as privileged providers? One, we can advocate for anti-racist spaces and clinical communities, even if it compromises profit within a capitalist framework. We need to speak up. We need to be heard. And we need to not let it go. There can be fear in certain spaces to not, call people out, to not call out a system. But we need to recognize that money is not everything in life. I hope we all realize that, right? Like, money is not, at the end of the day, it's not about the money. It's about character. It's about quality of work. It's about ethics. It's about humanity. It's about so much more. It's about spirituality. It's about connecting to love and community, and not just focusing on, money. So we really need to advocate for anti-racist spaces, and also maybe advocate for ways in which you can provide community care at a lower cost, and find creative ways to do so. Provide training on marginalized treatment as well as outreach to serve outside socioeconomic communities. Again, from the beginning, you don't know what you don't know. I really didn't know about a lot of community resources. I didn't know about nonprofits. I didn't know about state-run facilities very well. What I did know about them was that you're in and out. It's really hard to get into them. So, the more I learned about marginalized treatment, and how I was, how am I contributing, in a positive way, it really did help me to open up my eyes to where I could be of more service. Advocate for policy changes pertaining to marginalized groups through political involvement or social media educational material. There's back and forth on whether social media is really effective. It can be. If anything else, it makes people feel seen. It's not necessarily about like changing somebody's mind or perspective. It's more like, hey, I'm somebody that sees you. I see your population. I see you. I see who you are. And I'm gonna advocate for you, whether that be in a social media platform, whether that be through trainings that I do, whatever it is, right? Finding your place to really participate. And political involvement. I'm going to talk more about politics a little bit later, but it is a privilege to not talk about politics. It is a huge privilege to not talk about politics, especially in the therapy room. So I'm going to talk about that because I know that can be controversial for some and maybe uncomfortable, but you got to bear with me on that, because politics is not just politics. It's legislation. It's laws against people's bodies. It's laws on if people can get married. Is somebody going to be able to have healthcare or not? I mean, these are life issues, right? And so for us to ignore that and put it under the guise of politics is unfair. And I do think it's a really privileged perspective. So I want to talk about that a little bit later. But also stop ignoring race and privilege as it pertains to treatment planning. This has happened a lot in my career. I will see a white clinician who is working with a person of color, and yet the fact that they are a person of color and what that experience was like is not brought up or discussed. No, it always needs to be discussed. We really need to stop ignoring race and privilege. Because and the case consults that I do, I think it's next slide, you're gonna see why. We can't ignore race. Even if it's a transracial adoption, we can't ignore race. We can't ignore systemic racism and privilege. So if it makes you uncomfortable to talk about it or bring it up, then that's your personal work to do as a clinician, so that you can get into a space of opening your heart and acknowledging that, clients will put their emotion on us regardless. If it has to do with race and privilege, okay, that's another piece of the puzzle. And we need to really look at that. Okay, so first case. This is somebody that I work with for free. When the BLM movement started, you know, I had to dig deep in within myself because of medical reasons, not my own medical reasons, but just whatever. I couldn't protest, basically. And so I was like, what is my protest gonna look like? Like, what am I gonna do for my community to really see that that there is a lack of resources? So I put it out there that I would do a handful of free sessions, again, filled up like that. And this is one of them. And so we'll get into it, but Black cis gay male, age 31, client is overweight yet medically healthy, immigrated from Haiti to Florida at the age of 8 through dangerous passage. Client does not remember details of travel, yet remembers seeing his aunt get murdered in Haiti when he was 5. Client moved to LA at the age of 25 to pursue a career in entertainment. Client works gig jobs at restaurants and bars to pay the bills. Client has had some success in his career. What? Oop. Yes, in his career. Sorry, that is a typo. Due to COVID, client is unemployed and is unable to pay rent. Client does not own a car and relies on old residual checks, and unemployment has been delayed to survive. Client participated in BLM marches in which he saw guns, which triggered his trauma related to his aunt. Client came to therapy for the goal of decreasing behaviors that cause negative consequences. He acts out through substance use, excessive spending, binge eating, and detached sexual experiences. Whew, so the intersectionality with this person is huge. So first we have Black male. One thing that you need to know is African American is now outdated language. We say Black with a capital B for the specific reason that is presented here. This is a Haitian immigrant who is in America. He is not an African American. He is a Black man. He's a Haitian, but he's a Black man in America. So he is going to have the same systemic issues that an African American would have, right? So we need to recognize all Black communities. Another thing that was told to me is people from Africa do not want to be described as African Americans just because they're living in the United States. They want to be African. So we've just decided, I guess as a whole, that it's going to be Black with a capital B. Don't be afraid to use the word Black when you talk about Black folks. But anyway, okay, the intersectionality is Black. This is a gay man. Also, he is overweight. So there is fat phobia within society. So we have to take that into consideration. He has pretty severe trauma, early childhood trauma. He also, right now, he doesn't have a car. So, you know, it makes it hard for him to get around and get to his job. He does not have health insurance. He cannot afford it. And so it's been a real struggle, especially during COVID, because unemployment office has been backed up. And he just finally got through, which is exciting, but it took 2 months for him to get through, to get money from unemployment. So when we look at this case, we need to understand the intersectionality of what he has gone through. The other piece that we don't really, well, maybe you guys do, I didn't in the past, is that he's also an immigrant. And when we look at immigrant mental health, it's pretty bleak. Immigrants have trauma right off the bat, usually, if they immigrated in a way that was through unsafe passage or illegal immigration. It can be really dangerous and horrific. So we need to also keep in mind that that's a piece of the puzzle and a piece of who he is that we need to hold dear. Also, cultural competency. I've had to look up a lot on Haiti, on the Haitian community, because I am unfamiliar with that culture. he has been able to teach me. But that's something, again, as a clinician, it is my job to make sure that I'm aware of the cultural value system and what that looks like. So immigrants have a 90% increase in anxiety, 70% increase in depression, 42% skip scheduled healthcare, if they have healthcare at all. So immigrants fall within marginalized communities for sure. And this particular individual is Black and an immigrant, which brings a whole other slew of material and things that we are processing through, and the deep-rooted trauma from a very early age. So yeah, marginalized communities. Oh, and by the way, this person is not homeless. This person is I mean, he's middle class, but he's not somebody that, you would look at and be like, oh, you don't have the resources for therapy. But he doesn't have the resources for therapy because most people don't have the resources for therapy that are in marginalized groups, because if you look at socioeconomic disparity, that's just not in the cards. So we are working together for free, but what I can tell you is I have learned more as a clinician working with him than I think I ever have. Just the nuances, the cultural difference. I mean, it's so just because it's free does not mean that I am not, as a clinician and as somebody who's learning, isn't getting something out of it as well. When we think about, okay, well, if you're not getting paid for it, how do you stay in the game? I love working with this particular person because it's effective and because he wants it so bad because he hasn't been able to get it. And it's a different experience, a beautiful experience, to be honest. Okay. Next is a Black cis gay male, age 18. Client has white adoptive fathers. Client was raised in predominantly upper socioeconomic neighborhoods. He was admitted to a sober living for excess marijuana use. He graduated high school with poor grades, has a learning disability, and was not engaged with mirroring face-to-face contact with birth parent for an extended period of time. Client has flat affect and poor cognitive functioning, which contributes to sexual impulsivity. Client reported feeling as though his parents viewed him as a novelty rather than a real son. In my career, I've worked a lot with transracial adoption. And one of the main pieces of transracial adoption is acknowledging race and culture within that framework. With this particular case, the parents treated their son more as a novelty. And what I mean by that is there are people who adopt pure of heart, want to have children. It's beautiful, beautiful experience. When you are adopting transracially, there comes a responsibility to really acknowledge what your child is going to go through that you may not have ever gone through or will go through. So there needs to be acknowledgement of that piece. What happened for this kid is that his family, they tried to bring in, a godmother that was Black woman. They tried to kind of interact, but the way they would talk about him, the way they would talk about his hair, specifically that they didn't like his hair in certain twists or in certain ways. I mean, it really did hit home for that kid. So when we think about intersectionality, we need to think about the fact that this kid has white parents. What is that like for him? Went to predominantly white schools. What is that like for him? Has trauma related to birth family. What is that like? The high socioeconomic class. Now, this is what's really interesting is high socioeconomic usually means privilege. In other instances too, what is it like to be a Black kid in an all white community? How does that feel? That brings its own set of emotions, of experiences, right? So we have to acknowledge these differences. We have to acknowledge that, okay, yeah, so just because he has the resources he needs doesn't mean that he isn't feeling oppressed. Doesn't mean that he isn't feeling unseen. This particular kid, I don't work with him anymore, but this particular kid decided to be on his own. His parents said, you can come and live with us. You know, they were moving at the time. And that kid said, no, I can't. He was so detached from his parents. He felt like he was an other. And we really had to work through that. And the parents, you know, the dads really tried, but there was a disconnect between the privilege that they had and how he felt being a Black child to them and to gay dads, you know, and he was gay. I mean, it was this whole thing, right? That was just, there was a lot there. So really pinpointing the nuances and the intersectionality is important. And this is actually a book, if any of you work with transracial adoption, this book, I have not read it, so, but it was recommended. You know, the people that I've worked with have said that they've read this book and that it really helped them, so I'm passing it on. But embrace and integrate birth culture into upbringing, validate core abandonment wound around separation from biological family, refrain from token language and enthusiasm. Another thing with transracial adoption, there can be this like, I have a Black kid, or, you know, like, yes, woke or whatever. It's like, that's not what this is about, right? And there can be that piece, and you can feel it, right? You can feel that there is this kind of novelty or tokenism, and that's toxic that's toxic. Surround child with toys, games, and literature with diverse cultures and racial identities. That should be done with all children, regardless of race or transracial adoption, but still, this is important for people who maybe are not considering that part. Explore, live in diverse neighborhoods and cultures. Even if you are located in a high socioeconomic community, it doesn't mean you can't go to other types of neighborhoods with different socioeconomic status and eat or go to a park or hang out. Show that there are different cultures, there are different areas, especially if you live in a predominantly white area. You need to get out and go to other places. And then converse openly about race and privilege. So don't ignore race, don't act like it doesn't exist. Really talk about it with your kid at any age. At any age. It's not inappropriate. Talk about it at any age. Okay. Finally, the last case consult. Okay, I'm doing good on time. Uh-oh, am I missing questions and stuff? I'm kind of breezing through. Oh, no, time. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the last case concept. So cis, straight, mixed, Black and white, female, age 31, sober due to substance abuse issues, small business owner and model, is currently dating a mixed race cis male who works in tech. Client came to session due to feeling anxiety and stress around the BLM movement. Client has experienced light skin privilege most of her life and now feels quote unquote seen as a Black woman who is pitied or weak. Client reported stress in her romantic relationship and feeling excess anxiety due to political climate and COVID. So this is different in that she is upper middle class socioeconomic status. I should have put that in there. There are differences between people who are lights. Okay. There are perceived differences in the Black community between light skin to darker skin. That, thankfully, is dissipating as time goes on, and it is definitely a symptom of systemic racism. But we do need to recognize the nuances. So being mixed in the US is different than being somebody who had two Black parents. You also see both sides of the coin. I am mixed myself, I'm half Black, half white. White side, very not such a fan of Black people. Black side, not such a fan of white people. That's how they grew up, very segregated. My parents' accident had me, here I am, but that was a real reality. Both sides were not cool with it. So being mixed and in the middle of that you're gonna have feelings around it. What she's talking about here is about the fact that she has felt privilege, and now because of the movement, which is really fascinating, because you would think, right, that all of these issues are coming up and people are, starting to figure it out and starting to recognize that this is a really deep, bigger issue than we maybe wanted to accept. But she's saying this has impacted her negatively. People see her. When it was like Black-owned businesses, she got a slew of people. And the dialectic for her was, that's great for my business, and it's great that people want to support Black-owned businesses. And I feel seen as somebody who needs that support. And she's like, and she hadn't experienced this. She had experienced other racism in her life, or other situations around her, light-skinned privilege, but this was really profound for her. And so when we work with individuals who are a part of diverse communities, we need to look at how these different nuances can play a part. It doesn't mean that the BLM movement is not helpful, obviously. It doesn't mean that, her getting extra business is horrible and the people who did that aren't aware. That's not what this means. It just means, as clinicians, we have to look at like how racism is so complex, and how marginalized communities are so diverse in their experience. And we need to look at them each individually, and put ourselves kind of in their shoes so that we can best treat and help and provide safety. Also, politics. A big piece of what she's, working on is, a big piece of what she came in about is because of the political climate. So that leads me to politics and mental health care. We have to discuss politics. It is what it is. Politics as it pertains to quality of life and direct physical/mental health. Politics equals human rights issues. To not discuss politics is to contribute to the ignorance around systemic challenges that affect mental and physical health. Ignoring quote unquote politics is ignoring a vulnerability factor. We need to stop with it's private. No, not when it comes to people's human rights. And you're gonna have people coming in the room. Every person of color that I work with talks about politics. Every person of color that I work with talks about the day-to-day struggle of our current administration. So to ignore that or to disregard that is doing harm. And so also, as clinicians, we need to be talking more about it. That is my stance on it. You can take it or leave it, but it's not about politics anymore. It's about human rights. It's always been about human rights. It always has been, but people are insecure and don't want to open up about their political stances because they don't want to offend people, maybe. Well, think about why maybe that's offensive to somebody. Is it because it hinders their ability to live a full and free life? Because if so, maybe that's work you have to do. Okay. So policies, we need to be involved in that. Racism is a political issue rather than a human rights issue. Yeah, racism is not political, it's human rights. So we need to really be aware of that. Socioeconomic privilege and systemic racism. Politics has to do with how money is being distributed, which then affects marginalized communities. LGBTQ rights, women's rights. Why do we get so emotional when it comes to political views and opinions? Because it's our life. It's our life, it's our livelihood, it's who we love, it's how we get resources. So yeah, people are going to be passionate about it. And if you're uncomfortable with that, check yourself, check your privilege. If you're somebody that cannot be political, check your privilege. That is a privilege to not be political or be affected by politics. And then finally, and we're almost done, Beck, I know I'm a little over, access to care. Even people who have insurance still have difficulty in getting care. Private practice clinicians don't always take insurance, and we know why that is. It's a lot of work for a little return. So, we have to also look at how access to care is even denied for folks who have the privilege of health insurance. And so how can we help with this piece? Insurance versus personal commitment to sliding scale or scholarship fees. So we don't have to take insurance, but we sure can slide as low as we need to without having to deal with insurance. We can slide down to premiums. I know it's not a lot of money. You can subsidize and offset. You can charge full fee for certain people and go lower for others. You can commit to 2 to 3 open spots for low, no cost services. You can commit to that. Is it exhausting? Yeah, it's tiring, but you know what? We're in a crisis right now, and as clinicians, we got to suit up and show up. Like the doctors, we need to do that for mental health. Challenge clinical norms and systemic privilege disparities. It's okay to challenge systems in a respectful and, a respectful way, eloquent way, but we need to be challenging clinical norms. I think we're going to be moving away from the DSM. It's incredibly pathologizing. Especially for marginalized groups. They don't even have like racism trauma in the DSM. I mean, it's not, I could go on and on about that, but we don't have time. So we need to be challenging some of the things that we just do because it's what we were taught. And we need to recognize that we can change things to fit everybody and to make it a better world. Okay, get involved in politics relating to mental health funding and access to resources. We need more financial help. So let's vote. When they say defund the police, it means reallocation of funds. And those allocation of funds could go to mental health care, and we need it desperately. Continue to remain teachable, and also continue to learn about and implement complex care within your practice. Okay, so that's it. Yeah, thanks. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you. All right, here I am. Thanks so much. So we have a couple questions, and if anyone is, type your questions in now, because we have, a couple, 20 minutes or so. I also wanted to, thanks to Bonnie for putting in I'm going to put in the chat here about the BI POC project. Let's see, I'll type it in a minute. It's not letting me cut and paste, but the bypocproject.org is a great place to go to learn more, because when we're thinking about this, I mean, you only had an hour and there's so much to this. So one of the questions is, this has been awesome. I have a question. I have heard the use of marginalized communities is pejorative. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't think so, but again, everybody is different. When I think of marginalized communities, I think of the margins, right? The margin disparity. So margins when it comes to socioeconomic privilege, margins when it comes to, resources in general. So that's how I think about it. So for me, I don't think it is, but again, everybody is different, and I'd love to hear whoever you heard that from or where. I'd love to hear their point of view on it.
Yeah, actually, Chevelle stated, do you think underrepresented is better? Maybe using that verb.
The reason, because represented, I don't think it's about representation as much as it is about recognizing that people have limited resources. But sure, that's also another great term. Whatever term works, I think. And this is the thing for me too, like I'm very big on language, and there's a point where it's like intention versus like what is effective. Do you know what I mean? Like my intention is never to disregard a community. It's to lift them up and to talk about that. So I think it's about intention. So what is your intention in the words that you're using? And for me, my intention for marginalized group is I want us to think about the margins, the different margins that are so offset. and also the groups that kind of get put to the side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Any more questions? They're rolling in. Chevelle said, I like that. Thank you. As you know, a person of color working as a therapist, what are some challenges you see, even in maybe like employment or getting jobs or things like that? Have you experienced that yourself? Like, I think you touched on it a little bit, like when you're looking at different facilities or different, employment agencies, it's like you only see white people or cis white people on their website and things, and how that makes you feel, like, do I even want to work here? But I mean, maybe you can share some of your experiences in that sense as a therapist personally.
Yeah, I think for me, what has been challenging is being one of very few Black cis women therapists. I think the other piece is too, there have been times where I've felt as I've gotten older, being able to communicate my feelings or being able to communicate ideas has gotten easier. But early on in my career, there was a lot of anger and frustration. And I realize now that that was because I was a person of color in a predominantly white field for the most part. And so when I would talk about things pertaining to race, sometimes it wouldn't necessarily be absorbed because of either the delivery or, the intensity, which is valid, to be honest, and it's not effective, because in order for people to really hear you, you need to come from a place of wise mind, I'd like to say, if I want to go to DBT, where we're taking into consideration our emotions and the logic of it all, and people's experience. I have been lucky to work for places mostly that are pretty, they're open to those conversations and they're open to talking about it. So I've been lucky. But it has been hard to find resources for folks, because I am getting a lot of people, like people of color right now, queer also. And to find a queer Black clinician is like, it's not easy. So it's heartbreaking to me, that there aren't enough resources. And it is hard to be primarily in a private pay industry where I see the discrepancies. I see where we are not actually giving access to all communities, and for financial reasons. And that's just kind of how the system is set up. And I've played into that system completely. So to kind of shift that and move in a different direction has been eye-opening.
Yeah. Actually, this actually speaks to the next question here can you speak to impact versus intent in regards to like microaggressions where someone,
Yeah, I think both and. So, okay, intent meaning, if somebody is expressing a microaggression, what was their intention? If we have inherent biases, we have systemic racism in our brain, even me, I've had to work on that for myself. So I may say things and have said things in my life that were inappropriate, that were a microaggression, right? My intention was not to do harm, but I did. So I have to sit with that. And that's okay. And we have to sit with that. We're going to make mistakes. And it may not be our intention, but it doesn't mean we don't do harm. So it's okay to sit in that space and be wrong for a minute and then adjust.
Right. Get uncomfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get uncomfortable with, when you get called in or saying like, that was a mistake. I've definitely had to sit in a lot of this impact around racism, around class, around the things that I've said. I think you have actually called me in on a couple of things as well, which I appreciate, because sometimes I'm just like, oh yeah, and we're going a mile a minute, and we have to stop, and we really have to have this humility around I don't know what I don't know. And I also, when I find out, then I'm responsible.
Mm-hmm.
When I know that I'm responsible.
Totally. And I had a similar experience with a family friend of mine. I was trying to make a point around looting and all of that. That's a whole conversation, but people focusing on looting. And I said, I said something about Compton, like do you guys go to other communities or whatever? And I had somebody call me out and be like, I don't want you to tokenize Compton as like the Black community, and to tokenize it as the low class Black community, because she's like, I grew up there. It's a beautiful community. There's, everybody, like, it's not the stereotype that everybody thinks about. And I had to check myself, my own privilege in that moment of, oh yeah, I just like tokenized my own race, and kind of put Compton in this bubble. And so when we get called out, was I uncomfortable? For sure. Was I embarrassed? For sure. And I was like, you know what? I hear you. And that was not my intention. And I'm sorry. And, I'm definitely going to learn. And that was it, and it's not hard to get vulnerable, especially, and if it is hard, that's more work to be done.
Right. I've done that as well, where I, almost tokenize like places that don't understand LGBTQ folks around the South, right? Alabama, Arkansas,
Yes.
I've used that and have realized, I could talk about Orange County. I could talk about West Hollywood. I could talk about any of these places who have, who don't understand. So I have to remember that as well. I actually am going to put in the chat for everyone. It's the National Queer and Trans Therapist of Color Network, which is a place where you can go to find, which, Ashley will probably be a part of soon, but that, you can find people near you who are part of the community if you're looking for resources in that way as well. Any more questions? Have another minute or two. Again, I just wanted to thank you for opening up this conversation. Here we go. What advice do you have for new therapists, associate license in particular, to be able to provide sliding scale or free services to folks excluded from our mental health system right off the bat?
So I'll tell you what I did. I told my friends and family that I was going to be doing low to no cost services, and if they knew anybody, and I put it on Facebook, and it happened like that. Mm-hmm. So I think you don't have to go very far. The people that need low to free cost services or free low cost services are probably your neighbor. And you just don't know it, So I would just start by putting it out there in Facebook communities. And you can specifically say how many spots you have, how low you're willing to go, and the community you would like to serve. I think that that's appropriate, especially if it's a marginalized group, to specifically talk about that and say, I'm willing to take that on.
Yeah. And I would give it a little piece of advice too, is to, also, give yourself spots for that, because I think you take care of yourself in that way, because that could open you up to all of your spots being sliding scale or zero, and then you're just giving, and that's like a piece of self-care around therapy.
Oh yeah, no. I definitely, there's a certain number that I stick to, and certain spots, and they, and there's also different kind of, there's different ways in which you can do it to fit your schedule. I'm a workaholic. I love my job, and I love doing what I do. So I work a lot. And so it was easy for me to fill those spots, and to have some free in there and still make a living. I'm fine, and I can still work with people for free.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. What suggestions do you have for someone like me, a Black cisgender femme queer therapist, who is the only person?
Who are you? Because I want to know you.
Yes. Who is the only person with those identities in my town, but I'm also an activist? How do I navigate those spaces?
That's such a good question. First of all, hi, and I want to connect with you. Second of all, you are all of the above. And one thing that I will say about being a Black clinician or mixed clinician is that it is, if you are coming to see me multiple times and you see me, there is already an assumption of a stance. I'll just put that out there. There's an assumption that you are probably liberal. There's an assumption that you are for Black rights. There's an assumption because it's already on you. It's already written on your skin, right? So thankfully, I haven't had to work with anybody within private practice who has severely different ideals than I do, because that person would probably not come and see me. So when it comes to activism, when it comes to politics, that is brought up in the space as long as the client brings it up. And I am open with my thoughts and feelings and ideals around it as well, because that is validating for the clients that I work with. I validate their frustration. I validate their sadness and anger. I validate the desire and need to want to protest but can't for some reason. All of these nuances, I sit with them in that, and I acknowledge it, and I share too. I don't believe in being a blank slate. I don't believe in that. So that's not how I work. So navigating that is being both and being okay with expressing that within clinical spaces when appropriate.
Awesome. Let's see here. Any more questions? And don't worry, Ashley will get the emails, so I'm sure she'll email you so you can connect.
Chevelle?
yeah. So
where's Chevelle located out of? Do we know?
I don't know. We'll have
I'll find out.
Answer.
Oh wow. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, so I think it can be hard to find, and so also freeing to find someone who shares similar values, experiences, and finding supervision and connection in that way, so you can sit in that space. I can speak for myself, but finding a group of trans folks, trans therapists, to talk about being a trans therapist in this space. And how it also marginalizes you too, right? Like how we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves, that we can only work with, you can only work with queer, Black, cisgender women. And that's the only people you can work with, because your knowledge is so vast. And I think that there's a experience where clients can come in and we learn from each other, and we get to open up that language and that those experiences. I seek therapists that have different experiences than me, so that I can grow as a person and get different ideas. It's really important. So
I wanted to point out too, and I didn't bring that, Black trans women are one of the most marginalized communities. I have never worked with a Black trans woman. That is how marginalized they are, and also the resources available. So I wanted to put that out there, because they're also, that community is getting murdered. That community is being terrorized by their own Black brothers and sisters. So I think I just wanted to put out there that that's another thing that we need to think about. How is, I don't know if anybody on here has ever worked with a Black trans woman. I have not had that. And to me, that says there's a huge issue with getting resources out.
And I'm wondering if, as a person of color, the even seeking mental health services, right? The stigma of seeking mental health services, how that can be difficult hurdle to jump over for a lot of people. Saying, I was thinking specifically cisgender Black men and mental health.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's true. There is a pretty big stigma. it's also, it was never, I think the stigma also has to do with, it was never really, therapy is not thought of as something Black folks can do, to be quite honest. It's not, it's more of like a wealthy person in the Black community. It's thought of more as like, that's what wealthy people can do, because it's so it's out of reach for so many people that it's not even on the radar. But if we had it in reach, we might see that that stigma actually isn't really there. It's just that they don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about what therapy looks like or why people are in therapy. So yeah, I think stigma would go away if there was more access to mental health services.
Right. Someone had kind of posted that Black trans undocumented sex workers, are, of the most marginalized of identities.
Wow.
Where these intersections, right? That, so yeah, absolutely. We have a question about, working with disabilities. I'm a therapist in New York City. I'm also both visually impaired and hard of hearing, cochlear implanted, and work significantly with disability community. Your experience on that, because that's another,
marginalized group. I didn't even put them in. That's how marginalized. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so I have worked primarily with learning disabilities, with adolescents, but physical, I have not worked with physical disability. I've worked with a paraplegic once. I've had one client. So I don't have a lot of experience around that population and need to definitely do more research on that.
Yeah, awesome. Rebecca says that happy to help for future presentations. I would love that. I think it would be amazing.
I would love that too.
And another, because again, we only have an hour, and even in that space, like in hours, but I would love to continue, bringing people in. It's something I'm very passionate about, is bringing people in to share these experiences, specifically with, therapists that may not have this experience. An attendee said, Black communities are not the only community that with that stigma around, obviously getting mental health services, but therapy modalities are Western based. We need broader treatment modalities taught and used for clients. And I would say also covered by insurance as well, because sometimes, this like CBT, even DBT, right? It's like, oh, well, we'll cover that for insurance purposes if you have it or access to it. But there's so many modalities of therapy that work for people that are not, clinical or what. However, I think that's the DSM actually puts that and ruins that for us.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to the disability piece. The intersectionality between marginalized groups is so broad that, like you said, for an hour, I mean, I'm going to miss so much, right? And I really think this is why we need to be talking more about this. We have a lot of presentations and talks on communities that we mostly work with, like majority communities, but we don't see a lot of presentations on minority communities, on marginalized communities, on communities that, because again, we're not seeing them. And then those people then feel unseen, right? So I think that that's what we need to continue this work around marginalized communities, and then open up spaces so that they feel like this is a place that they could actually have therapy.
Yeah, and another attendee said, ableism is another layer of oppression. And I think, even in this, I got a message about closed captioning, and I thought it was on and it wasn't. So after we record, we will have this closed captioned and sent to everyone, and it'll be on our channel, closed caption, so anyone could hear. That's super important, obviously. So I apologize profusely for that not working today. And yeah, Rebecca, I'm really excited that you may come on and do some work with with us here and share your experience. Again, Ashley, thank you so much, and look for more conversations and deeper dives into each of this stuff. So Do you have your email up on the last slide so people can get a hold of you, or if you have it?
Not on my last, but I can
Okay.
go back to my first, I
Okay,
think.
go ahead and go back to your first.
Whee!
Go all the way back through. Maybe.
That's my email.
Okay, that's your email. Great, there it is.
On the bottom, feel free to
Ashley.Roller
email
Stuff.
me. Do you see it?
Yeah. Yep.
At gmail.com.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't put my telephone number on anymore.
No, yeah, don't put your phone number on there.
No, but you can email me, and then maybe I'll give you my telephone number, and then we can talk on the phone.
And each month we do a 1 hour educational series, so be on the lookout for that. I think I have a friend, Justine, talking about nerd culture coming up around how to work with gamers and people who in Dungeons and Dragons and how to do therapy with them, which is super awesome.
Cool.
Totally out of the box thinking. And thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thank you. Awkward wave goodbye.
Bye.